All right, today we're tackling a huge, really complex question, and we're going to be using Dr. KANBİR's work as our guide. The big question is this: why do so many Muslim-majority societies seem to be facing these major socioeconomic hurdles? And to even begin to answer that, we've got to rewind a bit, go all the way back to where this whole idea of development even came from.
So, here it is. This is the central question, the one that really frames our whole discussion. It's a tough one, and it's been debated for centuries. Today, using our source material as a map, we're going to peel back the sociological and historical layers to get a much clearer picture.
So how are we going to do this? Well, we've broken our journey down into 5 parts. We'll kick things off by looking at the classic theories of development. Then, we're going to tackle a very common but flawed line of reasoning. From there, we'll dive into the identity crisis that followed, explore a potential path for renewal, and finally, tie it all together with the critical role of democracy.
Okay, first things first. We need to get a handle on how people even started talking about development. You have to imagine the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution is roaring in the West, and society is changing at a dizzying pace. The founding fathers of sociology were right in the middle of it, just trying to make sense of it all.
And man, it was a whirlwind of big ideas. Yet Comte, who saw this grand march towards a scientific age, Durkheim was focused on how our social glue was changing, Weber saw the rise of rationality and bureaucracy as the key driver. And then, of course, there's Marx, who believed it was all about the struggle between economic classes. Now, what's really crucial to remember is that all these theories were born from Europe's specific experience, but for a long, long time, they became the default way to look at progress everywhere else in the world.
So, what happens when you take that Western framework and apply it to, say, the Muslim world? Well, a lot of people took a huge leap to a very simple but also a very wrong conclusion. And this brings us face to face with a major logical error.
It has a fancy Latin name, argumentum ad hominem, which literally means to the person. It's basically a character attack. So instead of digging into the really complicated economic and political reasons for a problem, you just blame the people themselves, their character, their culture, or in this case, their beliefs. And here you see this fallacy in its classic form. The so-called logic goes something like this. Okay, this group of people is underdeveloped. What's their most obvious trait? Their religion. So, their religion must be the cause of the problem. It's an intellectually lazy argument that lets you avoid all the messy but important details of history and economics. But of course, when you actually look at it, this whole argument just doesn't hold water. I mean, first off, underdevelopment isn't some exclusive club, right? It's found in all sorts of cultures and religions. And look at the developed world. It's a mix of all kinds of religious and secular backgrounds. Here's a real kicker, though. It turns out that intense secularization often comes after a society develops, not before. So it's more of a result than a cause. The bottom line is, just pointing the finger at religion is way too easy. It's a shortcut that lets us ignore the actual issues.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. A lot of people within the Muslim world started to internalize this criticism. You've got colonial powers dominating them, their economies are in decline, and this leads to this massive, profound identity crisis. And that crisis gave birth to a powerful new political movement.
I love this quote from the great 14th century scholar Ibn Khaldun. He absolutely nailed this psychological dynamic centuries ago. When you're faced with a more powerful group, there's this incredible pressure to think, well, their culture must be better, and that the only way to catch up is to copy them. And this led to what our source calls a flight from themselves. You had intellectuals and reformers who started blaming their own culture for their problems. They argued that the only way forward was to just ditch their own traditions, their own institutions, and import everything from the West. As you can imagine, this created a really deep sense of cultural alienation. So out of all this turmoil, Islamism emerges. And this is key, our source explains that this wasn't just some simple religious revival. No, it was a thoroughly modern political movement. It was a direct response to everything that was happening, the colonialism, the identity crisis, and the struggle to develop.
But this movement wasn't unified. It pretty quickly split into 2 main camps. On one side, you had the modernists. They were trying to reform Islam to kind of fit into a Western model. But in doing so, they often lost touch with their own rich intellectual history. And then on the other side, you had the traditionalists, who reacted by doing the opposite. They retreated into a super rigid, literal interpretation, basically slamming the door on any new thinking. The source argues that in the end, neither of these paths really offered a dynamic solution for the modern world.
So, if just copying the West didn't work, and a rigid retreat to the past didn't work,
What's left? What's the way forward? This brings us to the book's big idea for renewal.
The Turkish poet Mehmet Akif Ersoy just says it so perfectly here. The point isn't to throw out your core texts. The point is to re-engage with them, to find a way to make them speak to the challenges and the mindset of today.
And the mechanism for this, according to our source, is to revive the tradition of ijtihad. Now that's a powerful concept that basically means reasoned interpretation, intellectual effort, and struggling with the texts. The whole goal is to carefully separate the timeless, universal principles of the faith from the specific cultural rules that were meant for a particular time and place.
And this quote from the composer Gustav Mahler, it just perfectly sums up the entire argument. Tradition shouldn't be about just mindlessly honoring the past. That's just worshiping ashes. True tradition is about keeping the fire, the core energy, the essential principles, alive and burning bright for the next generation. It's about a living flame, not a dead pile of dust.
But here's the thing. This kind of deep intellectual renewal can't just happen in a bubble. For it to really take root and flourish, it needs a certain kind of political and social foundation. And that brings us to the final and absolutely crucial piece of this puzzle.
Just take a look at these numbers. They're pretty stark. This is from The Economist's 2023 Democracy Index, looking at 57 Muslim-majority countries. And you see that number for full democracy? It's a big, fat 0. Not a single one. And down at the bottom, a whopping 41 of them, the vast majority, are classified as authoritarian regimes. That's a massive institutional challenge you just can't ignore.
And this is where it all comes together. The project of intellectual renewal and the project of economic development aren't separate things. The source makes a powerful argument that neither one can truly succeed without a solid foundation of political freedom, economic liberty, and real, accountable, democratic institutions.
So that leaves us with one final, big question to chew on. When we look at all the huge challenges and the really lively debates that are happening in these societies today, this is what it all boils down to. Is the focus just on worshiping the ashes of a past that's long gone? Or are there enough people out there working to keep that fire of a living, dynamic tradition burning bright for the future?